Okay, our next speaker is Keith Winstein. He is an associate professor of computer science at Stanford. He's also affiliated with the engineering department there. And at CSAIL, he's had two stints here. An earlier stint was when he was working with Hal Abelson and Jerry Sussman. And later he did his PhD with Hari Balakrishnan between like 2011 and 2014. In between, he was a reporter for the Wall Street Journal. And now his research group at Stanford creates new kinds of network systems by rethinking abstractions around communication, compression, and computing. So over to you, Keith.
Thank you. Uh-oh. Now let's just do it this way. All right. Well, thank you, CSAIL, for having me here. This is a huge honor. This is probably the most intimidating audience I've ever had for a talk, so appreciate you all being here. I came here when I was 18. I guess I came to LCS or AI in January of 2000, and I found this book from the LCS when I was born, actually. This is the year of my birth, when ProjectMac was 18 years old. And it was funny to leaf through this. You all look kind of the same, honestly. I mean, this is literally the year I was born. You haven't changed. I have. But this is kind of the spirit of the lab in the 80s. There's a round of vest. And then double the age of ProjectMac is when I showed up. I was 36 years old. And when I came to MIT, honestly, what we did was not hot. Computer science, AI, this was not the cool thing to do. The cool thing was biology. And I hung out like on the 4th floor with Sussman and Tom Knight. They were doing synthetic biology, all this cool stuff. And we were all told, don't major in computer science. Definitely don't do AI. That's hopeless. And computer science, you can end up coding in some cubicle farm, before your job is inevitably outsourced. We were sort of right here. I guess we just saw that. The hot thing to do was synthetic biology. When I took 7012, in my class was Donald Troxel, famous professor of EE, getting trained on the new hotness. And there was sort of this air about the place. It seemed like an air of sort of happy pessimism. That's what it felt like. This is kind of, when you talk to the grad students, I used to go to the GSB where the grad students get drunk, but for the first sort of 20 minutes, it was very interesting to listen to them talk. I was like a freshman. This was kind of the era, you talk about robotics, like you weren't kind of expecting it to work, but it was sort of a happy pessimism around the area. And there were a lot of very interesting things happening then. Here's Rodney Brooks giving one of the God and Computers talks back at 25 years ago, and Don Knuth giving a talk about God and computers. And Rod Brooks had this saying, I hope I don't butcher this, but about the juice. What is sort of the essential spirit? Okay, well, I don't want to, the essential spirit of what is the thing that animates it? And I realized that for me, the juice of this discipline, why did I major in this, such an unpopular major at Course 6, at the time? I think the juice for me, the motivating luxury that we labored under, was the knowledge that the mystery was ultimately solvable. The mysteries that we solve are inside the box. So I did some work with Jerry Sussman on trying to figure out what is the essential difference between a vacuum tube preamp and a transistor preamp. But we were going to solve that mystery. That mystery is solvable. When you're trying to debug something, the mystery is solvable. That's very motivating if you know that through hard work, you will ultimately solve the mystery. Just like one of those Columbo episodes. They show you the crime in the beginning, and Columbo's going to catch the killer. It's just kind of how's he going to catch him? This makes us different kind of from the biologists or the astronomers. The astronomers, I don't have to wait for another supernova. We don't have to wait for another supernova. You can just rerun the thing again. That was really a motivating luxury. For me, this was the juice. This is a very exciting thing. And so motivated by that, I did a lot of things that were probably not helpful to advancing my academic career, but they took a lot of work, and they were motivated by the sense that we could solve the mystery. So we figured out how DVDs worked, or we helped reverse engineer DVD encryption. We did an IAP class. Here's me and Hal Abelson a long time ago. And then 15 years later, this ended up as art. It was auctioned off at the Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Museum as a necktie, our DVD descrambling software. When this building was being built, before it was open, it was one of the first RFID card readers, the first card reader on campus. And we snuck out of NE43 a network analyzer, or a spectrum analyzer in the middle of the night to go figure out how these card readers work so we could reverse engineer them. I don't know if you remember, there used to be a security guard to make sure you didn't bring a laptop out of that building. People remember? So we're lugging this like very expensive and heavy thing out at like 2 in the morning. The security guard's like, it's not a laptop, is it? Like, no, it's test equipment. All right, carry on. So we figured out what was going on, and ultimately we were able to crack the encryption, and we presented this to MIT, the card office. They thought it was fun, and ultimately we built this box for Richard Stallman to help him get in without being tracked. Then he lost it. I don't know, that's what happened. Ultimately, my first attempt at a PhD did not really go, anyway, it didn't go great. You were very kind to give me a leave of absence. I went to be a newspaper reporter at the Wall Street Journal, initially to cover technology, but I found it extremely difficult to write for the newspaper about something that you know. So I ultimately wrote about science and medicine, and I got very interested in statistics. And again, this is a world where it felt like the mystery was solvable. This Colombo principle was still there, so I found sort of, people were miscalculating p-values, things were happening. It was a lot of fun to be a reporter. It's kind of like being an academic, kind of, maybe faster paced, and it was a very intellectually stimulating environment. Ultimately, I came back, and with this sort of new interest in statistics, working with Hari, I started to think, can you come up with a statistically optimal way to decide when to send packets and when to not send packets on the internet? There's a problem called congestion control or distributed resource allocation. There's a long parade of PhD theses and schemes in this world of congestion control. And so we came up with one scheme called Sprout, based on model predictive control that tries to, here's Sprout up here, tries to get good throughput and low delay. And we actually did a 6829 experiment where we had, here's sort of, here's what Skype does, here's what Sprout does, here's the Omniscient, the Oracle scheme. And we gave this as a problem to the class, and they came up with a whole range of approaches. That was kind of fun to see there's a whole spectrum of approaches to this problem. You could sort of map out a Pareto frontier. The idea of thinking of these problems as sort of amenable to program synthesis or reinforcement learning, I think was kind of a new thing at the time in this world of computer systems. So we thought, can a computer do this? Can you synthesize a multi-agent congestion control scheme from reinforcement learning? So we developed this system, a REMI, where you could synthesize these different algorithms for different sets of assumptions about the network and different objective functions, and you could make, sort of the Pareto frontier here for different objective functions. It was all a lot of fun. You could even, in this sort of Leslie Valiant sense, try and measure the learnability of this problem. How well, for different breadths of training, does the ultimate trained artifact generalize? So if you train on a very small thing, it works very well within the scenarios that it's trained on, the environments it's trained on, but pretty poorly outside. And as you give more and more breadth of training, it works better and better. This was a really fun graph to make. I don't often see this graph in machine learning papers. I at least enjoyed it. So this was my thesis. And then I went off. I got a faculty job at Stanford, and I should say the lab was incredibly nurturing in that. I think people have talked about how, I just want to echo the comments that were made. I mean, people that were not my advisor, like Franz Koschek and Nikolai Zeldovich, were like, you must do a practice talk for us. And then didn't go great. So they're like, you must do another practice talk. And then I went and did some interviews, and they're like, now you must do another practice talk. I was like, I'm already on this, no, the level of nurturing that I got, I think, from this lab was really incredible. And my advisors and Hari and especially and Jerry and all that, I'm really grateful for that. So before I went to Stanford, I talked to a lot of faculty here, many of them from Stanford, Leslie Cabling, Barbara Liskoff, Martin Reinard, I'm sure I'm forgetting a lot of people. I said, I'm going off to Stanford, and they said, yeah, we were there. And they said, Keith, so the ad for Stanford is kind of like, it's just like MIT. You're here, you're going to be playing volleyball 24/7. You're going to be playing volleyball with other famous people who came from MIT. He'll be playing volleyball with you. And actually, other famous people from MIT, they'll all be playing volleyball. It's just like MIT, but with more volleyball. But really what the faculty here who were from Stanford had said was, you got to watch out with this sort of happy pessimism thing you're doing. Because at Stanford, it's going to be more like craven optimism. That was the story. And I did see some of that. Actually, let me turn up the sound here. I hope we have the sound. I did see a little of that. So here's a film that actually OpenAI commissioned about themselves a few years ago that I was asked to review. Let's see if we can play the audio. Uh-oh. Could we turn the sound up, please? Uh-oh, well, let's do it without the sound. But you can see they're talking about how they're going to solve global warming, hunger, poverty, education, child mortality, water access, healthcare access through neural networks. I don't know if this is true. I don't want to say it's not going to happen. Maybe you can solve infant mortality and poverty and water access, but I don't think I don't know. I don't feel in my bones that kind of optimism. But I think I was very lucky when I came to Stanford that I was right on the vanguard of a huge wave of junior faculty hiring. So our department now is like half junior faculty, and I think the world has changed. I think now we're much more like MIT. You all have hired many more Stanford people. So I think I was very lucky to go there at the time I did. But what I started to find is that many statistical results, including my own ones, have had a hard time generalizing to the real world. I made that graph about sort of synthetic generalization. But in real life, when you try and run it, this sort of sim to real problem, it often doesn't work, despite your best efforts to evaluate it in the context of an academic paper. Our early findings are often optimistic. As Tomas said this morning, when I try it, it never works. That's kind of my experience, too, with a lot of machine learning. So here's Sprout in my PhD thesis. And then we set up a whole system to run it all over the world. Here's Sprout in India. It doesn't really work the way it did in our evaluation. Here's Remy again, my PhD thesis. Doesn't really work as well in real life. So my results don't work. Here's a big MIT paper on machine learning for video streaming. Some students at Stanford tried to do it. We can't replicate the gains. Here's a New York Times story, 2008. Google says they can learn where the flu is going to happen before the government does. It was a Nature paper. They said big things about how it's going to track the flu and save lives. They put up this graph about how well they can predict the flu. Now, what they don't tell you is that the graph is like 90% training data. They show you this. It should tell you that. But then, what's kind of interesting is it works, and then it just blows up. Nobody knows why. They eventually just give up on it. Here's a different paper from some colleagues trying to predict unemployment claims from Twitter. It seems to work. Here's where they write the paper, and then after they write the paper, here's what happens. It blows up. Here's a paper from Microsoft. They think they can detect if you have pancreatic cancer from your search queries. Here's a paper from, too soon for this? Okay, we'll skip that one, okay. And here's a paper from us on, we set up our own video streaming website to try and measure this prospectively. So not with a data set. When you hear people say about data set, that's a retrospective analysis. So here we're talking about sort of a data flow with the opportunity to intervene. This is a prospective study. And what we found is that reinforcement learning and MDP schemes for video streaming, despite their own evaluations, they don't beat the much dumber policies in real life. So here's the very dumb policy. And these sophisticated schemes, contrary to their own evaluations, they just don't beat it. It's actually very difficult to get these reinforcement learning schemes to run sim to real. I think part of that is that it's very hard to make this graph in real life. How do you quantify the breadth of training for one of these reinforcement learning things when you talk about real life? We don't know how to do that. It's very hard to get a simulator-trained RL agent to work well in the real world. We tried it, it still didn't really work. There's actually a new paper this year, it won Best Paper at NSCI from MIT, run on our infrastructure to try and produce real to sim, to try and go from reality to a faithful simulator. But this is like state-of-the-art work to try and get something, reinforcement learning, that has to be trained as a simulator to work in real life. So I got cynical about this. I was like, these guys are always overclaiming. I'm going to go back to being a happy pessimist, Screw this craven optimism. And I actually was a consultant on the HBO Silicon Valley TV show. I worked with them a lot. The writers, we talked extensively. We wrote this whole monologue and a whole plot line for the last season. The only thing that survived was this monologue where he says, F gradient descent. It's the only thing that survived all this work. But I don't think you can have this attitude without a lot of self-doubt, because it's undeniable that there's amazing accomplishments that have come from gradient descent, just in the last 18 months. You can't be oblivious to that. It's obvious gradient descent has done some incredible things. So my colleagues recently had an email chat on our faculty mailing list. Is AI an existential threat? And I think here we're thinking about sort of the Terminator scenario. And I don't know what you think. Most people don't seem to think we're at the Terminator point yet. But I do think there's a lot of other threats, a lot of other steps to the apocalypse that I think are more likely. Threat number one is sort of the sociological threat. The extinction of us as sort of Homo sapiens. If you look at what's happened from giving teenagers smartphones with Instagram or Snapchat or TikTok, this is probably could be 60 decibels worse than that. I think that's plausible. And that's probably not positive for our society. Something like half of our undergraduates report that they know people abusing study drugs for supposed cognitive improvement to do better in their studies. It's probably the same at MIT. I don't know if you've surveyed them. It's probably the same. This is probably a lot worse than that. Would you put a GPT-9 implant? And if everyone else did, I'm pretty scared about this. I would say I feel pretty threatened by this sort of sociological threat. Two is a threat to the discipline. This Columbo principle, this confidence and motivation that comes from knowing that the mystery is solvable. I feel threatened. I don't know if we still have this. This contemporary AI pushes us much closer to being biologists or astronomers. Those are not happy people. I was here during the depths of COVID. I visited here. And I think Boston, I think you all had a harder time of the pandemic than we did playing volleyball in Palo Alto with John McCarthy. And I heard the most depressing sentence I've ever heard. I mean, I spent 15 years here in Boston. I love this place. I heard the most depressing sentence I've ever heard from someone at MIT. They said, "The pandemic turned MIT." And I don't think you meant that as a compliment. So I hope this is not true. I really hope this is not true. But this is the threat number 2, the threat to the discipline. And threat number 3 is the sort of centralizing, consolidating pressures that we see from the consolidation of who gets to do computation in a small number of privileged entities. I was a newspaper reporter during the financial crisis. I saw the internet shrink the news business to a few major outlets. No one has the job of local school board reporter anymore. That's pretty bad for our society. Big AI is accelerating this consolidation of computational power and innovation into a small number of entities. ChatGPT, it's not an LLM, right? It's an internet service where you interact with a putative LLM. You don't even have the levers to run it reproducibly. You can't, this is the same kind of restrictions a magician places. You do a magic trick, you say, now do it again. They say, I'm not gonna repeat the trick. ChatGPT won't repeat the trick. You don't get the random seed. You don't get to run it reproducibly. You don't get to do differential analysis, a small signal analysis. That's very frustrating. Major innovations historically come from unexpected places. They come from places they aren't supposed to come from. The airplane came from 2 bike mechanics in Ohio. For that to be possible, there has to be a job of bike mechanic that's distributed all over. That knowledge, that innovation has to be distributed all over. The internet didn't come from the telecom industry. The World Wide Web, it came from research staff at a particle accelerator. Akamai came from theorists. So to make this possible, innovation has to be possible in places it's not supposed to come from. It can't be a small number of consolidated entities, especially entities that have a casual relationship with the truth. This notion of a post-truth society, it's not that far-fetched. I'm going to skip this, but Google, when they make a mistake, it's streamed on YouTube, they just go in and edit their database to make it look like they didn't make the mistake. They use their privileged access to the YouTube database to just edit it as if it didn't happen. That's evil. That's 10 years ago. That's not AI. That's just a different relationship with the truth. Google's also alleged to cheat the auction, the supposed second price auction. Hal Varian went around talking about how great it was. Apparently, they've been cheating the whole time. They make all their money from shill bidding, supposedly. So the idea of consolidating more power and more ability to compute in a small number of entities, that's quite dangerous, I think. Well, it doesn't make me happy. So we have a modest proposal to restrain the consolidation of computational power, which is that when I want an answer that requires computation, I'd like to be able to refer to the computation, to name that computation in a reproducible way. We should all benefit from innovation that comes from unexpected places. So what this suggests is privileging the notion of computation to become a first-class thing. It would be nice to have a common language of computations, so anyone can, in theory, evaluate them. It would be nice to have an objective notion of correctness. And it would be nice to have an economic model for computation that rewards innovation. So you can't bill for the resources consumed. When I give a computation to Amazon or Google, the more they take to do my computation, the more money they make. That seems like the incentive is in the wrong direction. So you've got to find a different way to reward computation. So we think the foundation of computing should be a computation. We're building an operating system for distributed computation that represents computations as first class, not processes, containers, VMs, lambda implications, it's computation. The core principles are just a common objective notion of correctness, a separation of I/O and computing, fine-grained visibility and application data flow, and it turns out you can get this in about 40 nanoseconds. It's pretty cheap to get this. If you could do this, I think we could end up in a world where maybe there's only a small number of entities that have the compute power, but they're accountable to us. We pay them for results, not for effort. And I think if we make them accountable to some high-level abstraction like correctness, that could permit agility everywhere else. We could have the ability to run cold reproducibility. We could have the ability to outsource computation to whoever wants to do it. We could have the ability to permit innovation coming from unexpected places. We could have some policy remedies, maybe short of breaking these companies up, that might still be powerful. Maybe ChatGPT gives us a hash to name the computation they do, and maybe 10 years later they have to unblind the hash and give us the information to reproducibly reevaluate that computation. Maybe there's a sort of time-limited exclusivity for these models. I think there's lots of policy options that are opened up once you can name a computation. So I guess I'm still a happy pessimist. I mean, that's what you all taught me to be. But I don't think you can have that attitude without feeling a little bit threatened right now. I don't think the existential threat, the Terminator scenario is not the one I'm super worried about. But I do think the sociological threat about AI making us stupid is a risk. I think the disciplinary threat about AI making us like biologists or astronomers is a threat. And I think that consolidationist threat, the centralizing pressures, restricting where innovation comes from, I think is a threat. I mean, can we resist this? I sure as heck hope so. And I think the idea to provide a means of reference to computation is a way to help avoid a sort of 1984 scenario and preserve the open-mindedness to prevent innovation from unexpected places. I think that's valuable. I think that's a positive step forward. But I think if we go down, this is how it's going to be, one of these things. All right, thank you to many members of the lab who've helped me along my many years here. Hal, Jerry, Pari, many other people. Thank you for inviting me to this. It's been wonderful. Thank you.